Imagine this. A CEO, known for his sharp business acumen and strict policies, decides to go undercover in his own store. But when he hears what the cashier has to say, it leaves him frozen in his tracks. What he discovers will shock you. Stay tuned to find out how one simple conversation turned everything upside down. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. The Bright Byte logo looked the same on every storefront, clean, familiar, and almost comforting in its predictability. Michael Grant had designed it that way. For more than 2 decades, he'd led the fast food empire from a modest regional chain to a household name. But as growth plateaued and costs crept up, the board had pushed for change. That meant streamlining, restructuring, and yes, cutting. Michael wasn't a man who led from behind a desk. At 61, he still believed in showing up, not with fanfare or cameras. Quietly, observing. That Tuesday afternoon, he parked his sedan a few blocks away from Bright Byte store number 27. Tucked beside a laundromat and a nail salon in a quiet suburb just outside Chicago. No chauffeur, no security detail, just a navy windbreaker, a pair of old walking shoes, and a baseball cap tugged low enough to blend in. Inside, the store buzzed with the soft chaos of late lunch. A couple wrangled their toddlers at the corner booth. A delivery driver juggled 2 paper bags. And behind the counter, 3 employees moved in steady rhythm. The air smelled of fryer oil and fresh coffee. On the surface, nothing seemed off. Michael took his place in line, eyes scanning without staring. A young girl at the register, early 20s, maybe, was handling the crowd with a kind of tired grace. Her name tag read, Lena. She smiled with every customer, even when it clearly cost her. Then came the moment that stopped everything. As the last customer walked away, Lena leaned closer to the young man beside her and whispered, just loud enough for Michael to catch it. They cut our hours, but we still gotta do everything. I swear I almost passed out last night. And nobody gives a damn. Michael froze, not visibly, but something in his chest tightened. He glanced at Lena, now laughing softly at something her coworker said, as if the weight of that complaint hadn't just slipped from her lips. He paid for his sandwich, thanked her, and stepped outside. The sun was out, traffic slow. A bird hopped across the sidewalk, but the sentence echoed in his ears louder than the honk of a distant horn. Back in his car, he didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he stared ahead at nothing, then slowly pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then typed, I want the full HR and performance data for store number 27 over the past 3 months. Quietly, don't mention my name. He hit send. Outside the window, life continued like nothing had happened. But Michael's mind was already a few steps ahead, retracing the past. Wondering what else had gone unnoticed. He hadn't planned on getting involved. Not today, maybe not ever. But something about that whisper refused to leave him alone. The next morning, Michael arrived at headquarters just after 6. The sky was still a dull gray. Not quite morning, not quite night. He slipped into the building through the side entrance he'd used for years. The one no one really paid attention to. His office on the 19th floor sat quiet. Lights off, blinds drawn, just the way he liked it when something needed looking into. Ava Chen arrived 15 minutes later. She didn't knock. She never did. That was their unspoken agreement. I flagged the internal dashboard, she said, handing him a tablet. I pulled the 3-month report you asked for on store 27. Numbers look tidy, but they don't make sense. Michael raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Ava knew her job. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. Staffing hours dropped nearly 20% compared to the same quarter last year. But revenue's actually gone up by 8%. She continued, no terminations on file, no resignations either, but there are 2 employee IDs that just stopped showing up. He stared at the screen a moment longer, then set it down. Ava waited, as she always did, quietly. Anything in the complaints archive? Nothing public, but I'm checking the secure logs now. Anything submitted anonymously or flagged as confidential. She hesitated. There's a name that keeps popping up in the bonus reports. Raymond Cruz, the branch manager. Michael leaned back in his chair. That name rang a faint bell. Something about regional awards, efficiency, cost control, maybe a company newsletter a few months back. Recognition for optimization, Ava said, almost like it was a dirty word. Michael didn't respond. He rubbed his chin slowly, eyes still on the report. Then stood. I want shift schedules, time clock data, and performance reviews for every employee at that location. If there's anything from quality control, send it straight to me. She nodded. You're going back there, aren't you? He looked at her briefly. And for a second, the corner of his mouth pulled into something between a smirk and a sigh. Let's just say I left something behind. By dusk, Michael found himself once again standing in line at store 27. Though this time the energy felt different. The crowd was thinner, the staff quieter, the same air of routine hung in the space. But something beneath it buzzed uneasily. He ordered coffee he didn't intend to drink, paid cash, and as he turned to leave, he, accidentally, left his wallet on the counter. Just enough of an excuse to come back 15 minutes later. The manager wasn't on site. Michael had checked through Ava's back channel, but the assistant supervisor, a tall man with a clipped tone, was in full command. When Michael returned, he stayed near the corner, waiting, observing. What he saw didn't sit right. Lena was standing near the supply rack, clearly just returning from the restroom. When the supervisor stepped in, "You think this is a break room?" he snapped. "We're not paying you to disappear." "I was gone 2 minutes," she replied, voice low. "That's 2 minutes longer than you get during rush hour. If you can't handle the pace, maybe this isn't the place for you." Michael's grip tightened around his coat. He said nothing, not yet, but the weight of it pressed down hard. He walked out again, slower this time, letting the anger settle into something more focused. As he stood outside, his eyes wandered to the Employee of the Month poster in the window. There was Raymond Cruz, all teeth and pride, smiling beneath a bold font headline about leadership through lean operations. But what hit Michael wasn't Raymond's grin. It was the absence of someone else. He didn't see Marta. She was on the 10-year service recognition list just last quarter. A steady employee, reliable, but she was gone, and no one had said a word. Back inside, he approached a young man mopping near the soda machine. "Hey, isn't there usually an older lady here during night shifts?" "Marta, I think." The boy hesitated, looked down at the floor, then mumbled, "Marta, it's better not to talk about her." Michael didn't press. He thanked the boy and left quietly. Later that night, in his office, the city lights flickering behind him, Michael sat alone. He stared at the framed photo on the shelf beside his desk, taken at last year's leadership retreat. Raymond stood right next to him, holding a plaque. Something about that smile gnawed at him now. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "Something's rotting from the inside, and I need to find out what it is." The building felt colder than usual that morning. Michael sat alone in the boardroom with the blinds still down and a cup of black coffee that had long gone lukewarm. In front of him, a printed stack of policy documents, internal emails, and performance evaluation guidelines sat like a quiet accusation. He had signed off on all of it. Not blindly, he had read every proposal, weighed every metric, but he'd trusted the system too much. Trusted that the people under him would wield that autonomy responsibly. The phrase that kept circling in his head was one he'd written himself in a memo a year ago: encourage local initiative. Empower managers to lead without handholding. Back then, it sounded like wisdom. Now, it tasted like negligence. Ava walked in carrying a thin folder and a look of hesitation. She didn't sit. "We found something," she said. 2 internal complaints were submitted through the whistleblower platform. One flagged labor violations. The other mentioned a forced resignation. Michael turned to look at her, his voice low and deliberate. "Why didn't we see these earlier?" Ava placed the folder on the table. They were removed after reaching local management review. Both went through store 27. He opened the folder. The complaint was plain, direct, no names, just a plea. "We're being asked to work beyond our hours with no extra pay. 2 employees have quit. The rest of us are afraid to speak up." Michael closed the file and rubbed his temples. Then, Almost as an afterthought, he asked, "Was there anything with a name?" Ava nodded and tapped her phone. "There's a deleted message. IT recovered it from backup. Came in 2 months ago. Written by Marta Vasquez." Michael sat up straighter. Ava read aloud. "We are being pressured to work unpaid hours. Younger staff are leaving. I've been threatened with forced resignation for speaking up. I was told my performance was slipping. But the truth is, I'm being pushed out." He didn't respond right away. He stood, walked over to the window, and looked out over the city. After a long pause, he said, "Find her. I want to talk to her face to face." Ava nodded. Later that afternoon, they drove through a quiet residential block on the edge of the city. The houses were modest, small porches, trimmed hedges, wind chimes tinkling on the front doors. They parked in front of a pale blue one-story home with a tired-looking roof and a cracked walkway. Ava rang the bell. A moment passed before an older man answered. White undershirt, pressed slacks, weathered hands. He looked cautious, guarded. "Mr. Vasquez?" Ava asked gently. "We're looking for Marta." The man's posture stiffened. "She's not here." "I'm Michael Grant," the CEO said, stepping forward, his tone calm. "I run Bright Bite. I believe your wife worked for us." Luis Vasquez studied his face. For a second, he didn't blink. Then, slowly, his eyes softened. "I know who you are," he said. He let them in. The living room was small and clean. A cross hung near the window. On the mantel, a faded photo of Marta in uniform, holding a 10-year anniversary plaque. Her smile was proud, not flashy. "Earned. She doesn't want trouble," Luis said as he sat across from them. "But she didn't deserve what happened." He went on to explain. Marta had spoken up when a young cashier fainted during a rush shift. Management didn't like that. A week later, she was called into a closed-door meeting with Raymond Cruz and told her attitude was disruptive. That she no longer fit the team dynamic. They gave her a choice: sign a resignation letter quietly or be marked incooperative. She chose what she thought would protect her dignity. She cried for days. Luis added, voice low. She loved that job. Before they left, Luis excused himself and returned with a plain envelope, worn at the edges. She wrote this, meant for your board, but it never went out. Maybe it still matters. Michael accepted the envelope and thanked him. Back in the car, he opened it. The handwriting was careful, almost formal. The letter detailed unpaid hours, pressure to re-sign short-term contracts, the manipulation of performance reviews. And at the bottom, in a final scrawled line, "I did not resign. I was forced. They forged my name." Michael folded the letter slowly. He looked out the window as twilight crept across the neighborhood, casting long shadows over the quiet houses. He didn't say a word. But inside, something had shifted. By the time Michael returned to headquarters, the clouds over the city had thickened into a dull gray, the kind that made the glass windows on the upper floors reflect nothing but their own coldness. He stepped off the elevator and walked past the morning bustle without slowing down. His mind was already 5 steps ahead, and his patience had thinned out. In the HR department, he asked to pull Marta Vasquez's personnel file, complete with video records of her final shift. The request was met with silence at first, then with a polite but nervous reply. "There's a gap in the security footage," the department head explained. "That day's files were corrupted. We couldn't retrieve them." Michael stared at her. "What do you mean, corrupted?" The system flagged a hardware error. That whole afternoon, gone. Ava was already on her phone when they stepped back into the hallway. "Something's off," she said. "That kind of gap doesn't happen unless someone makes it happen." She scrolled for a moment, then looked up. "There's someone I trust. He used to work in Brightbyte's IT security. Handled backup audits. Transferred out last year. His name's Caleb Tran." An hour later, they sat at a quiet cafe off a frontage road. Just a few booths, chipped ceramic mugs, and a waitress who didn't bother asking for their names. Caleb arrived wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked more like a weekend dad than a tech specialist. He nodded at Ava, then sat across from Michael. "I heard you wanted to talk." Michael didn't waste time. "We're looking into store 27. Marta Vasquez. The footage from the day she left, it's gone." Caleb sipped his coffee, eyes down. "I figured that day would come. He said quietly, I was asked to delete some logs. Not outright, but to trigger a failure that would wipe specific timeframes. They didn't give reasons. I didn't ask. I did what I was told. Who gave the order? Regional operations. Not through company email. It came from a personal line. I recognized the voice. Raymond Cruz? Caleb nodded once. I didn't want to be part of it. So I filed for transfer. Michael leaned forward. Do you still have any of the logs? Caleb hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a flash drive. I didn't erase everything right away. Just mirrored the drive and saved it. I kept it in case someone ever came looking. Michael didn't touch the drive. He just looked at Caleb. You're putting yourself at risk. I don't want trouble. I have a family. If this goes public, leave my name out of it. You have my word. Back at headquarters, things had begun to move faster. Raymond had picked up the scent. He wasn't stupid. His office had received a few unusual scheduling requests. And someone from legal had started asking about contract renewals. That morning, he called a meeting with his regional managers. Words going around that there's an internal audit. He said, his tone tight, I want full compliance across all branches. No exceptions. Later that evening, he sent an email to the board's HR subcommittee. There have been unverified rumors about internal investigations. I want to clarify that all practices under my supervision adhere strictly to corporate guidelines. It was the kind of email meant to sound calm while hiding a storm. What Raymond didn't know was that Ava had been watching him. She traced an unusual login from his credentials at 11:48 the previous night. It accessed a restricted HR directory, employee records, time cards, and payroll summaries. She flagged the activity and ran a differential scan. His changes didn't go through. She told Michael, I froze the system 10 minutes before he tried to modify the logs. He's scrambling. Michael didn't respond immediately. He simply walked over to the window. Hands in his pockets, eyes narrowed against the fading skyline. Let's prepare a compliance review, he said. A full walkthrough at store 27. No warnings. Bring legal, and someone from labor compliance. He paused, then added, let's make it loud enough that Raymond hears us coming. Later that night, as the office emptied out and the city lights blinked in the distance, Michael was wrapping up calls when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Caleb. No attachments, just one line. I found the backup log. It's all there. Marta's face, her voice. You need to see it. Michael sat still, staring at the screen. For the first time in a while, he felt something shift, not just frustration or anger, but a sense of reckoning taking shape. They met early, before the streets filled with traffic or coffee shops buzzed with regulars. Michael and Ava parked behind an old hardware store on the outskirts of town, where Caleb had chosen the meeting spot. A small break room in the back of the shop had been turned into a temporary office for Caleb's side work, mostly freelance IT support and private security system audits. No signs, no labels, just 4 concrete walls, a desk, and a borrowed monitor. Caleb didn't say much as he set up. He plugged in the flash drive, double-checked the volume, and clicked play. The screen showed a grainy hallway feed from store 27. Timecode running in the bottom corner. Marta Vasquez walked past the cash register and paused near the office door. She knocked once. The door opened, and she stepped inside. The camera angle cut to another feed, this one inside the office. Raymond Cruz sat behind a desk, arms folded, a sheet of paper already waiting in front of him. Marta stood across from him, arms tense at her sides. I only said what was true. Her voice rang clear through the cheap audio. That girl fainted because she hadn't eaten all day. She worked 10 hours without a break. How is that my fault? Raymond leaned back. You're not helping the team. Marta, you're creating friction. I stood up for her. That's what a decent person does. Then maybe this job isn't a fit for you anymore. He pushed the paper forward. Sign it, or deal with legal for disrupting workplace harmony. Marta didn't move. Her breathing grew shallow. After a full minute of silence, she reached for the pen, signed, then stood up and left without another word. Her eyes, though, stayed on the floor until she disappeared from frame. Michael exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. This isn't just management. This is psychological coercion, he said. Ava remained quiet, then spoke. If we bring this to the board, There has to be an official investigation. No more side channels. Michael nodded. Do it. She closed her laptop but didn't leave the desk. There's something else I need to check. That policy Raymond quoted. Streamlining long-term staffing, it's too specific. That kind of language doesn't come from a regional manager. She returned to headquarters that afternoon and pulled the archived approval records. The internal system required digital signatures on all strategic HR policy changes. After some searching, she found it, a document titled, Cost Optimization Through Workforce Restructuring. It outlined protocols allowing voluntary retirements to be encouraged among senior staff. Legal had watered down the language, but in practice, it gave store-level leadership the room to push out anyone over a certain tenure. At the bottom, beneath several digital endorsements, was Michael Grant's own signature. She hesitated before walking into his office. He looked up from his notes. You should see this, she said, handing him the printed copy. He read the title, then the fine print, then the line he'd signed. I thought it was about streamlining overhead. He muttered. They sold it like we were trying to reduce redundancy. I didn't think. But the words didn't help. The weight of it had already landed. His policy, written with good intentions, had become a weapon in someone else's hands. Meanwhile, in a quiet boardroom 2 states away, Raymond Cruz had gathered 6 store managers from neighboring branches. Look, I know you're hearing things. Investigations, audits, all that, but none of it changes what we do. Stay consistent, keep your logs clean, and if anyone asks, our numbers are up, our staff is happy, and our operations are in line with corporate expectations. He paced while he talked, his usual calm now laced with irritation. If you get asked about turnover, emphasize seasonal transitions. If anyone mentions complaints, remind them our HR system's been reviewed. We need alignment, no freelancing. One of the managers, Dana Bell, stayed silent through the entire meeting. She'd worked at Store 29 for just under 4 years. Marta had trained her when she was fresh out of college. Scared and overwhelmed by her first real job, Dana had kept her head down since then. Took her bonuses, avoided drama, but something about the way Raymond talked, like none of it mattered, burned at her. She pressed record on her phone, just low enough in her pocket that no one noticed. That night, as the office lights dimmed and Ava was preparing documents for the audit, her inbox pinged, an email from a name she hadn't seen in months, Dana Bell. No subject line, just a short message. I used to be afraid of him. Not anymore. Attached was an audio file. Ava pressed play. The meeting room was dim, the blinds drawn, the lights deliberately soft, not for atmosphere, but for focus. Michael sat at the head of the table, not as a CEO commanding a company, but as a man trying to fix what he'd let slip through his fingers. His face carried the weight of someone who had seen too much too late. Around him sat 4 others, each now a critical piece in the quiet rebellion forming within the walls of Bright Bite. Ava Chen, still sharp and steady, had her laptop open, cursor blinking against a background of internal documents. Margaret Lin, the company's legal counsel, was calm as ever, flipping through a small notebook. Caleb Tran, withdrawn but alert, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And finally, Dana Bell, the newest and perhaps bravest member of this circle, sat quietly, fingers laced tightly in front of her. Michael took a breath and started. This doesn't stay on paper anymore. We're moving. Margaret nodded. We'll need to establish wrongdoing from 3 angles. Forced resignation without due process, forgery of internal authorizations, and deliberate manipulation of employee records. Caleb added, I can verify the digital logs. If we match timestamps with the forged signatures, we'll have grounds for a data integrity breach. Ava looked up. We need a formal presence. An internal review team. High enough to carry weight but low profile enough to keep it quiet until we hit. Michael agreed. We'll make it seem like a routine audit. Nothing aggressive, just another regional check-in. He reached for his phone and typed out the message himself. An official invitation to Raymond Cruz for a scheduled performance review of Store 27. Worded carefully to sound dull and procedural. No indication of what they were really planning. By late afternoon, the invitation had landed in Raymond's inbox. At his own office, Raymond read the message 3 times. His gut told him something was off. The phrasing was too vague, too clean. He tapped his desk with a pen, then picked up his phone. The line rang once before a voice answered. "Yeah?" came the reply. "Warren, it's Ray. I got flagged for a surprise visit next week. Store 27. A pause. "You think it's heat?" "I think someone's poking around. We need to clean up the ledger. And I mean everything." "Already on it," Warren said. "I'll scrub the bonus allocations and standardize the staffing logs. If anyone asks, we were running a pilot on lean operations. All in policy." "Good. Make sure nothing leads back to my team." Warren hung up. Back in the quiet of headquarters, Margaret was going through archived bonus approvals. A 3-month-old payout to Raymond had caught her attention, not for the amount, but for the signature. It belonged to an HR deputy named Alicia Monroe. Problem was, Alicia had left the company 5 months ago. Margaret zoomed in on the file's metadata. The signature date didn't match Alicia's exit paperwork. Either someone had forged her name using an old stamp, or the approval had been fabricated post-departure. Both were a problem. She flagged the document and copied it to her private case folder. Meanwhile, Ava had arranged a coffee meeting with Joel Peterson, a junior accountant who used to work under Warren and, by extension, Raymond. They met at a bakery just outside the financial district, far from any recognizable Bright Bite location. Joel looked worn. He sipped his coffee with both hands like he needed the warmth to hold himself together. "I know why you asked me here," he said quietly, "but I have a kid. A mortgage. I can't get pulled into something that puts my name on a headline." Ava didn't push. She just waited. Finally, Joel sighed. "They asked me to adjust bonus metrics. Said it was for accuracy. But it always meant more money for upper management. I didn't know where it came from at first. But once I saw Raymond's name pop up every cycle, I knew." "You kept records?" Ava asked. He nodded. "Off the grid. I copied the originals before the edits. I still have them." Joel slid a flash drive across the table. No words, no ceremony, just a quiet handoff between someone who'd had enough and someone willing to do something about it. That night, Ava was back in her office, sifting through files and pulling up the new data Joel had provided. She paused only to glance at her screen as an alert popped up from the newly reopened whistleblower portal, an anonymous message. It was short. "Be careful. Raymond knows Michael is investigating. He's going to move first." A chill ran down her spine. She reached for her phone. The morning light filtered through the front windows of Store 27 as the staff buzzed with a nervous kind of cheerfulness. Michael stepped through the front entrance first, flanked by Ava, Margaret, and a representative from Human Resources named Brandon Wu. None of them wore their usual business attire. No ties, no briefcases, just clipped badges and calm expressions. It was a deliberate decision to look like a routine check, non-threatening, almost casual, but under the surface, tension crackled. Raymond stood by the service counter, arms folded, lips curved into a polished smile. "Good morning," he greeted them. Didn't expect such distinguished company today. His tone was smooth, but Michael didn't miss the faint rigidity in his shoulders. Raymond was ready. The store was spotless. Schedules printed and posted. Attendance sheets immaculate. Employees smiled with rehearsed warmth, their gazes flickering with something unreadable. "Routine review," Michael replied, holding his voice steady. "We're just checking alignment across branches." They moved through the store slowly, nodding at employees, complimenting cleanliness. But when they reached the back offices, Michael turned to Raymond. "Let's talk somewhere quiet." They entered the security office, a small, windowless room with a camera monitor wall and a single round table. Margaret stepped inside with them, placing her phone discreetly on the table as if she was checking messages. It was recording. Raymond leaned back in the chair. "You know," he began casually, "not everyone can handle growth. You either scale fast or get left behind." Michael remained quiet. Raymond continued, voice low. "Sometimes the system slows you down. Sometimes it needs trimming." Margaret scribbled something in her notebook without lifting her eyes. Michael looked straight at him. "We both know the cost of trimming too far." Raymond didn't flinch, but his knuckles whitened against the armrest. Out in the store, Ava initiated the secondary plan. She instructed Brandon to bring in the longest-serving employees one at a time for private interviews in the storage room. Under the guise of feedback collection, Dana quietly moved through the staff break room, handing sealed manila envelopes to trusted employees, simple forms. Officially printed, titled, Confidential Ethics Survey. Ava checked cross-referenced data from Caleb's backups, timestamps, email records, and badge scans. The discrepancies were subtle but telling. On paper, everything lined up, but the human side, the real schedules, the exhaustion etched into the staff's eyes, told a different story. Then Lena approached. She looked hesitant, holding something wrapped in an old paper towel. I didn't know who to give this to before, she whispered, but I think it's time. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, handwritten shifts with names and notes. Original schedule, she said. Marta kept it in case things went wrong. Ava carefully unfolded it. At the bottom, a signature. It was Marta's. Real, unshaken, different from the trembling scrawl on the resignation letter they'd found earlier. I remember watching her write it, Lena said quietly. She told me the computer logs could be changed. But ink doesn't lie. In the corner office upstairs, Dana uploaded her audio recording to a secure drive, Raymond coaching supervisors on how to stick to the narrative and avoid questions during audits. That alone would shatter his credibility. Just then, Raymond received a text. His brow furrowed. He excused himself and stepped outside the security room to call Warren. They're onto me, Raymond said, voice tight. Someone's leaking from the inside. We need to shut down any larger audit. Now. On the other end, Warren was silent for a beat. I don't think that's my call anymore. He finally said, you've got your hands full. Maybe it's time you focus on your own mess. The line went dead. Back inside, Michael waited. Raymond re-entered, but the easy charm had vanished. Michael pulled out a small folder and placed it on the table. Inside were 3 items. The authentic schedule with Marta's signature, the forged resignation form, and a printed transcript of the staff training audio. You can confess and cooperate, Michael said plainly, or we take this to the board and let the lawyers do what they do. Raymond stared at the papers. His smile returned, but it was thinner this time, like paint cracking over rust. I suppose every kingdom has its coup, he muttered. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone, opened an app, and pressed something on the screen. Michael and Margaret exchanged a look. Something had just been set in motion. It started with a flicker. Just a brief blink on the security monitors before the screens went black. Ava noticed it first. The live feeds vanished, replaced by a frozen frame of the hallway outside the break room. Then the office lights dimmed slightly as the internal network stuttered. A warning flashed on her laptop. Connection lost. She didn't panic. Instead, she leaned toward Michael and whispered, he triggered something. This isn't just a power glitch. She stepped aside and dialed Caleb. Something's down. Can you see anything from your end? There was silence for 2 seconds. Then Caleb's voice crackled through. I've got partial access. Looks like a kill switch. Embedded protocol designed to wipe or mask internal logs. He must have planted it weeks ago. Give me 10 minutes. I'll boot the shadow server. Meanwhile, inside the conference room, Raymond sat with his arms crossed, watching the sudden outage with an unreadable expression. Margaret didn't let her guard down. She kept herself between him and the door, arms folded, back straight. Michael didn't wait. He moved to the front of the room, where the staff had been seated in a semicircle. Lena, Dana, Joel, and 2 junior managers who had quietly shown signs of unease throughout the morning. Lena spoke first, her voice trembling but firm. He told us to lie. Said anyone who didn't play along was replaceable. Dana followed. He coached us on what to say. We were told not to mention Marta, not to bring up the overtime or the new contracts. Joel handed over a USB drive, his hand shaking slightly. Here, this is the real financial report. I kept the originals. He doubled his bonus, then buried the expense trail through discretionary funds. Michael took the drive, gave Joel a grateful nod, then turned to Ava. Ready? Ava tapped a key on her laptop, and the conference screen blinked to life. Caleb had managed to route a secure backup channel through the corporate VPN. A video began to play, grainy but clear enough. It showed Marta seated across from Raymond, her hands clenched. I'm just saying we're exhausted. People are getting sick, skipping meals. We're stretched too thin, Marta said in the recording. Raymond's voice was sharp. Then maybe it's time you step aside. You don't belong here anymore. He shoved a paper toward her. If you don't sign this, you'll be hearing from legal. I'll make sure of it. In the clip, Marta sat frozen for several seconds. Then, defeated, she scribbled her name. Gasps filled the room. Raymond didn't flinch. He stood, shoulders squared. I did what I had to. The company was bleeding. We were all under pressure. Michael didn't raise his voice. You were under pressure, he said quietly, so you made everyone else suffer for it. Raymond's tone changed. It turned sharp, defensive. I followed the model. Performance-based incentives. Efficiency over loyalty. That's what the board wanted. That's what you wanted. Margaret stood. And did the board ask you to forge signatures? Intimidate employees? Wipe internal records? Raymond's face turned red. You don't understand what it takes to keep these stores alive. I saved them. Ava interrupted. Then why embed malicious code into our infrastructure? Why did you plant a data kill protocol activated from corporate? She turned her laptop around. On screen was a string of script, partially decoded, traced back to an admin account created under the name of Marcus Yee, a former tech VP who had left Brightbyte 6 months ago. He was known to have been close to Raymond. Raymond must have used Marcus's credentials to access deeper layers of the network. Ava added, he built a safety net to cover his tracks. Not just here, everywhere. Michael's face remained still, but his hands tightened. Everywhere? Ava nodded. This isn't limited to Store 27. We need to start looking across all districts where Raymond held influence. Raymond chuckled, low and bitter. Go ahead, start your crusade, pull the threads, but I guarantee you, what you'll unravel won't stop with me. Michael stepped forward. You don't get to threaten anymore. Not these people, not this company. He looked around the room, meeting every eye. This isn't just about Raymond. It's about every crack in the system we ignored. Starting today, we audit everything, from the top down. Raymond leaned back, clapped slowly once, then twice. Well said, Michael. Very noble, but let me ask you something. He locked eyes with the CEO. Are you really ready to shine a spotlight into every dark corner of the empire you built? The morning after the confrontation, Michael sat alone in his office as the sun crept in through the tall windows. The skyline of the city looked still, almost peaceful, but inside the headquarters of Brightbyte, the silence was heavy. By noon, he had sent the memo that would send ripples across the country, a full internal investigation, spanning all operational districts, with a freeze on all performance bonuses and incentives. The wording was careful, but the meaning was loud and clear. It didn't take long for the outside world to notice. By late afternoon, major outlets had already picked up the story. Brightbyte launches national internal review. One headline read, bonuses suspended amid employee complaints. Another flashed across the bottom ticker of a finance network. On social media, the momentum swelled. Former employees, long quiet or ignored, began sharing their own stories. Posts tagged with hashtag Brightbyte Truth trended for hours. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was cold. A handful of board members convened in an emergency call. Faces on the screen looked strained. One voice came through with a measured tone, but the message was unmistakable. Michael, this could have been handled internally. The media doesn't need to know everything. Another followed with less patience. If this affects our stock valuation, your leadership will be in question. A third, unnamed in the email chain but clearly influential, sent a private message to his assistant, who forwarded it to Ava. If this spirals out, Grant is the first to fall. When Ava shared the message, Michael didn't respond right away. He stared out the window for several seconds before simply nodding. He looked worn, not just tired in the way a person is after a long day, but burdened by the weight of having to untangle something he once helped create. Ava, sitting across from him with her laptop, noticed the dark rings beneath his eyes and the way his fingers tapped slowly, unconsciously, against the armrest of his chair. You don't have to fix the whole world in a day, she said gently. He gave her a faint smile. I helped build the frame of this machine. If I don't stop it, who will? You don't have to win everywhere, she said. You just have to hit where it hurts. Pick the artery, not the limbs. While they spoke, another ripple hit. A video surfaced online, a grainy recording from an internal leadership meeting almost a year ago. In it, Michael's voice could be heard saying, "We need to clear out the older workforce if we want fresh productivity." It was cut right there. No context, no follow-up. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. Influencers posted commentary. Talk shows brought in pundits. The man who had just stood for the exploited was now being painted as the architect of the exploitation. Michael's phone buzzed nonstop. Emails, messages, calls from contacts both new and old, each either expressing concern or demanding answers. He called Ava, Margaret, and Caleb into a secure meeting. "I remember that meeting," he said, "but that's not what I said." Margaret nodded. "It's been clipped carefully. There's no metadata on the original. Just a looped cut." Caleb added, "I can try to trace the upload. But it was shared through burner social accounts. It's meant to look organic." Margaret leaned forward. "You could issue a press release. A written statement." Michael shook his head. "No one reads those anymore. They read faces. They listen to voices." Margaret exhaled. "Then do it. Hold a hearing. Public. No filter. No script. Just you and the truth. But understand this. Once you step into that spotlight, you can't take a step back. It's all or nothing." Michael didn't flinch. He looked at each of them, at Ava, who had stood by him through decisions that now haunted them both, at Caleb, who had risked his quiet life to pull truths from the shadows, and at Margaret, who had kept his conscience tethered to law. In the quiet that followed, he spoke. "If I was the one who laid the first brick in this broken foundation," he said, "then I'll be the one who lays the first stone to rebuild it." That evening, the headlines changed again. Michael Grant, CEO of Brightbyte, to hold public hearing, first in company's history. The statement was short. No excuses, no legal jargon, just a date, a time, and a promise. The truth, no matter the cost. The conference center had never seen a crowd quite like this. Rows of seats filled up quickly, some with employees in their blue and gray Brightbyte polos, others with reporters clutching recorders, camera crews adjusting tripods, and former staff sitting silently with folded arms. For all its sleek lighting and modern backdrop, the air inside buzzed with something older, reckoning. The stage lights came on slowly, then held still. The room hushed. Michael stepped out from behind the curtain. No tailored jacket, no branded pin, just a plain white shirt. The sleeves rolled up, the top button left undone. It was the kind of shirt you'd wear if you were about to fix something yourself, not delegate it. He walked to the podium without looking at the press section or the rows of investors in suits. Instead, he looked forward, into the crowd that reminded him of what this company had started as. "I'm not here to defend myself," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here to take responsibility." There was no sound but the quiet flick of pens and a faint murmur of cameras adjusting focus. Behind him, the projector lit up. The first slide was a flowchart, an internal model of the incentive system. It looked harmless at first, but then came the overlaid notations. Places where management bonuses increased while staff hours were cut. Timelines where whistleblower reports vanished without follow-up. Michael walked the crowd through it like someone explaining a broken clock. "This system was efficient on paper," he said, "but it had blind spots. And I signed off on them. That is my failure." He paused, looked briefly toward Ava and Caleb sitting near the side exit, then back at the audience. Raymond Cruz was not an anomaly. He was a byproduct. Next came the footage, the silent room filled with Marta's voice as she tried to defend a colleague. The pressure in Raymond's words, and the moment her hand trembled over a resignation she didn't write. Then the room heard Lena's testimony, recorded in a quiet office 2 weeks earlier. Joel's statement, Dana's clip, where Raymond spoke of managing perceptions and keeping mouths shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael turned back to the crowd. For the first time since stepping up, his voice cracked just slightly. "If you worked here, and were pushed out, if you ever gave more than you had and got nothing back, I want to say this clearly, I'm sorry. And I promise. That ends today." In a quiet living room across the city, Raymond watched the screen. He sat alone, his jaw clenched, his fingers drummed sharply against the side of his chair. But he didn't blink. The words stung not because they were new, but because they were real. Back in the building, Ava stepped out into the hall briefly. She and Caleb were monitoring the digital traffic around the event, watching for any tampering, and there it was. A sudden spike in bot activity. Attempts to flood the stream with misleading comments and negative hashtags. Same pattern as last time, Caleb said, already deploying countermeasures. Margaret, watching from the legal wing, picked up the phone without hesitation. Shut down third-party proxy access and log all IPs tied to known associates of Raymond Cruz. Inside, the crowd was shifting. Some people stood, some clapped quietly, others watched with tight expressions, unsure if what they heard was redemption or damage control. A journalist in the front row raised her hand. She didn't wait for a nod. How do we know this isn't just a performance to protect your position? Michael didn't flinch. You don't, he said calmly. But leadership isn't about keeping a seat. It's about earning trust, even when you've broken it. The journalist didn't speak again. As the event came to a close, and the room began to stir with the uneasy mix of reflection and speculation, Ava approached from the wings. She handed Michael a sealed envelope, simple, unmarked except for a small stamp in the corner. I found this during our system audit. Raymond authorized it 3 months before the audit freeze. Michael opened it. Inside, a copy of a consultancy agreement, hidden under supplemental human resource policy codes. It was dated, stamped, and signed under emergency clause provisions. He read the name at the top. Dominic Wren, Strategic HR Consultant, System Level Access. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. He said nothing, just folded the paper slowly and slipped it into his jacket. And for the first time that day, he didn't speak out loud. He just whispered a name. Dominic Wren. The next morning, Michael sat in his office with Ava and Margaret. The envelope containing Dominic Wren's name laid out flat between them. It had no smell of dust or time, yet it felt like it had been waiting to surface for years. Michael tapped his finger against the table as Caleb's voice came through on speakerphone. I tracked the login tied to that contract, Caleb said. Came from a satellite office in the north. One bright byte shut down 8 months ago. Used to be a training center for regional management. Ava looked up from her notes. That's where Raymond trained. Michael didn't speak. He just nodded slightly, as if a corner piece of a much larger puzzle had just slipped into place. Margaret leaned forward. Dominic Wren doesn't appear in any official employee logs. Not current, not past, but he had level 4 system access. That's just one rung below you, Michael. Caleb cut in again. And there's more. Dominic has a pattern. I pulled some consulting records. He's worked under different titles at 3 other corporations over the last 10 years. Always shows up during restructuring phases. Always pushes HR optimization models. And always disappears before the dust settles. Like a corporate ghost, Ava muttered. Margaret glanced toward Michael. Raymond didn't pull this off alone. Dominic might be the one who built the entire framework. The one who planted it across departments. Masked as efficiency. Michael stood and walked slowly to the window. He didn't need the blinds open to feel the weight of the skyline pressing against his chest. That afternoon, he called for an emergency board meeting. He laid out the findings: unauthorized contracts, buried terms, consultant access that bypassed compliance. When he asked for an independent investigative team with full access to all contracts, system activity, and payment records from the last 18 months. A low rumble of discomfort ran across the room. One board member, silver hair, sharp suit, cleared his throat. Michael, with all due respect, digging this deep, it could be catastrophic for investor trust. Michael didn't flinch. Then investor trust was built on a lie. And I'd rather tear it down than live with it. The silence that followed wasn't agreement. But it wasn't resistance either. It was the sound of people realizing the ground under them had already shifted. After the meeting, Ava approached him quietly. I found someone who might know more about Dominic. Carla Jennings, former HR director at Terrabricks. Fired after refusing to execute a strategic layoff tied to one of his plans. Will she talk? I asked her. She said yes. That evening, Michael met Carla at a quiet bar on the edge of the city. She wore a brown leather jacket and had the steady gaze of someone who'd been burned before but refused to break. He doesn't work for companies, she said, stirring her coffee slowly. He works for shareholders, the kind that don't put their names on public rosters. He shows up when they want numbers fixed, quietly, surgically. He rewrites structures, deletes records, and makes sure someone else gets blamed. Michael said nothing. Carla slid a folder across the table. Inside was a scanned copy of a consulting contract, almost identical to the one they'd found under Raymond's name. Except for one detail. In your version, Carla said, what's the clause under Authorization 12B? Michael flipped through. It was a coded line. Project approval by executive, ref. Code ID. IO472M. She nodded. That's the same code Dominic used at Terrabricks. It was a disguised signature line, meant to bind the CEO without informing them directly. If you signed a proposal that included that code. Michael closed the folder. His face was pale but unreadable. I did, he said softly. I signed off on a plan labeled Internal Workforce Optimization. I didn't know what it really meant. But that code, it was in the proposal. Carla leaned in slightly. Then you were used. Like me. Only difference is, you still have your seat. You can do something. Back at headquarters, Michael returned to his office alone. The lights were off. The hum of the city outside didn't break through the glass. But it still felt loud. He walked to the window and stared out. Seeing nothing but motion, cars, buildings, blinking towers. He whispered, not to the room, but to himself. I didn't just make a mistake. I signed off on it. I legitimized it. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. A CEO who once thought decisions were about numbers and policies. Not people. He took a deep breath. If I open this door, he said quietly, what's left to hold on to? 1 week after the public hearing, Brightbyte was no longer the same company it had been. Something had shifted, not just in policy, but in spirit. The air in the headquarters hallways felt a touch lighter. The usual shuffle of suits and badges had quieted, replaced by something that looked a lot like reflection. Michael stood before a group of managers in the glass-paneled operations center, watching as Caleb guided the technical team through the launch of the new internal systems. The anonymous whistleblower portal was now encrypted end-to-end, with no way for local management to trace submissions. Reports of misconduct would route through a multi-tiered process involving our legal and the newly formed Internal Justice Committee. Michael had made the announcement quietly that morning, without a press release or marketing campaign. He wanted the change to speak for itself. The Internal Justice Committee was composed not of executives, but of former employees, those who had once been told they were expendable. Among them was Marta, sitting beside Ava, calm but focused, holding a copy of the charter she helped draft. On her badge now was a title she never imagined she'd carry again, Senior Advocate. Labor Ethics. Meanwhile, the legal wheels turned. Raymond was indicted on 3 felony counts: falsification of records, unlawful termination through coercion, and financial manipulation. The case had caught the attention of corporate law circles across the country. Yet even with Raymond removed and his digital footprint dissected, one name lingered like a ghost. His access had vanished, servers scrubbed, login histories deleted, backup traces gone. Even his email domains had been deregistered days before Michael signed the public reforms. Caleb stared at the blank logs in frustration and simply said, he's not just a consultant. He's an idea with a login. That kind of structure doesn't disappear, it moves. The words hung heavy in the room. Still, progress pressed forward. The board, under public and internal scrutiny, begrudgingly acknowledged lapses in oversight. There were no apologies made. Not directly, but their decision to keep Michael in place, on condition that he continued system-wide reform, spoke volumes about the corner they had been backed into. Ava, now officially promoted to Chief Operating Officer, stopped by Michael's office that afternoon. Her promotion wasn't ceremonial. She had earned it, piece by piece, staying late through audits, tracking obscure access logs, facing boardroom resistance with steady fire. She sat across from him, legs crossed, holding 2 mugs of lukewarm coffee. If you had the chance to do it all over again, she asked, would you sign that proposal? Michael stared down at the mug. Steam long gone. No, he said, then after a breath, but if I hadn't signed it, I would have never known what it really meant. Or how far we'd let ourselves drift. She nodded once. The kind of nod shared by people who had walked through fire together. No grand epiphany, just mutual recognition. Later that day, Michael faced the press again. This time not behind a podium, not reading from a statement. He sat among a semicircle of employees, fielding questions raw and unrehearsed. No system is perfect, he said, and it's not policies or slogans that make them cruel, it's silence. The kind that ignores pain, buries complaints, calls them disruptions. We're not perfect, but we're listening now, even to the smallest whisper. That quote would run the next morning on every business outlet, from the Wall Street Journal to a front-page feature in a local union newsletter. But Michael didn't read any of it. When the crowd dispersed and the cameras powered down, he gathered his notes into a folder, tucked it under his arm, and stepped out into the atrium. The building was quiet. Most staff had gone for the evening. The light through the wide windows hit the floor in long golden strips. Near the reception desk stood Lena. She was in a new uniform now, dark navy. Her badge clipped with quiet pride. Supervisor, it read. She saw Michael approaching, straightened slightly, and gave him a respectful nod. Michael returned it with a small smile. No words passed between them. None were needed. As he walked past the automatic doors and out into the fading evening light, the wind caught the edge of his coat. The sky ahead wasn't clear, not completely, but the clouds were higher. Scattered. There was room now. Room to rebuild. Room to breathe. Room for something better. As we've seen in today's story, sometimes the truth is hidden right under our noses, and it takes a bold step to uncover it. The lesson here is that leadership isn't just about making decisions from the top down. It's about listening, truly understanding, and being open to feedback, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. We all have a part to play in creating a better environment, whether in our workplace or personal lives. What do you think? Do you believe true leadership comes from stepping into someone else's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our stories. We're just getting started, and there's plenty more to uncover.